Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to a wonderful Wednesday webinar for the Climate Emergency Centre Network, a ever-growing network of resilient community spaces. I think it's about 38 now. There's one in Eastbourne just joined up the other week. They've got a bit of a building in a community garden in Eastbourne. But tonight you've come to here and I'm very honoured to have Professor Hayley Fowler, who spoke at the National Emergency Briefing in Westminster Central Hall. Very inspiring. She's one of the UK's leading, she's from Newcastle University. I believe she's worked with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, and she's one of the UK's leading experts on extreme rainfall and flooding. And research advances the understanding of how precipitation extremes are changing in a warming world. And, you know, about extreme weather is not a future threat. It's what we're facing now. And she's an expert on flooding. So let's hear what you've got to say and see if there's a way that we can plant more trees and defend against the flooding and build a bit more resilient communities. Hayley, over to you. Thank you so much for coming. Over.
Thanks very much. Right, while I work out the logistics of sharing my screen, and I hope that's worked. Let me just put it into presentation mode. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me along this evening, and it's so wonderful to meet such a large group of people actually who are so engaged in trying to change things for the better. Right, I'm really impressed by all the people who've spoken so far, and you know, I really do think we need very rapid change and action, which is one of the reasons I was very passionate about being involved in the National Emergency Briefing in the first place. I've got a feeling that a lot of you will know a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight, but hopefully you'll learn something from the presentation. And hopefully it won't all be doom and gloom. I think we are going to see a lot more record-shattering extreme weather over the next few years, if not the next few decades. But hopefully we can be more prepared if we know what's coming. So I'm going to start with what happened in the summer of 2021. And you'll all remember these devastating floods in Germany. And I talked about these at the National Emergency Briefing as well. And these were something that really made the government in the UK, and I think a number of other countries as well, really sit up and take notice. Huge flood events, actually well forecast, made both more heavier and more likely by global warming, and I was part of a rapid attribution study that actually looked at this. But predictable and well forecast floods that killed over 200 people in Germany. A terrible tragedy, but huge amounts of rainfall over a very, very large area. And as I say, it precipitated a national inquiry in the UK by the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, where they were looking at whether our infrastructure is actually fit for purpose in this age of climate change. And it won't come as a surprise to anybody to sort of see the findings of the report by Dame Margaret Beckett, who led this inquiry. Really, basically, there's overwhelming evidence already that climate change is having a huge impact on UK infrastructure, and the government needs to get a grip on climate change impacts. And this is certainly something that, as part of the adaptation committee, we've noted and talked about in our progress reports. This gap between what needs to happen and what is actually happening in adaptation is widening. And actually, we need to recognise that prevention is better than cure. So we need to do something proactive about these risks that are increasing every day. And one thing I will say is that the climate change risk assessment, the fourth one, is out on the 20th of May. And we've produced something called the Well Adapted UK report as well, which is also coming out that day. And I can't tell you what's in those reports, but you know, they will be in the media. There's lots of briefing sessions that are planned for afterwards as well, after that launch event. So please do listen to what the committee is suggesting, because I think there's some good suggestions in there and some good recommendations for government. So I wanted to start with this kind of overview of where we are in terms of global risks and where we are in terms of climate change. I know that Kevin Anderson talked about this quite a bit at the National Emergency Briefing. But really, every year, the World Economic Forum on Global Risks produces a survey, and they look at what the risks are globally. And over the last few years, all of those top risks have been around environmental risks, and you can see that there. So in terms of long term, which they class as 10 years, I mean, I wouldn't class that as long term, but that is long term in the sort of World Economic Forum. All of those top 4 risks are around nature and climate crisis that we talked about in Westminster in November. Over the short term, things like conflict, wars, and misinformation and disinformation are also really a very big issue. And I think this is also an issue for climate change itself, and I'm sure that you all are aware of all of the misinformation that's going on at the moment around climate change. And I guess what I'm saying here is that these risks are intensifying. And when I show you what's happening in terms of the climate, we can see that we're seeing this intensification of warming as well. So 2024 was the first year globally where the global mean surface temperature was above 1.5 degrees. It was in fact nearly 1.6 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And you can see there on the right that, and these are really nice graphics that the BBC produced actually in 2004, but almost every day in 2024 exceeded 1.5 degrees of warming. And that's quite staggering, really, when you look at it. If we look at 2025, you can see that there was a marginal reduction in temperature. It obviously wasn't as warm as the El Nino year, 2024, but only just below 1.5 degrees. And that's obviously the Paris target that we're trying to keep well below. But we are basically pushing against that and have actually overshot on an individual year. And you can also see here that if we look at how the distribution of temperatures, the daily distribution of temperatures has changed globally since the 1940s, you see this staggering increase in temperatures since about the 1980s or so, and certainly since the 1990s. And you can see some interesting events in there. You see the 1998 El Nino, which was at the time a really, really big event and caused a huge release of heat into the atmosphere, so much so that climate skeptics were able to say there'd been a pause in global warming for around a decade afterwards, if you remember that event. So that was a really big El Nino event. But then you look at what happened in 2023, 24, and actually that El Nino event really dwarfed what happened in 1998. And I put this in because we're actually expecting a super El Nino to happen at the end of this year. And we're expecting this to be the biggest event that we've seen for 150 years. So, this is something that's becoming more and more likely. Obviously, as we get closer and closer to the time, scientists are able to make predictions about what's going to happen. And we're expecting a very big El Nino event at the end of this year. And if we do get one, which, as I say, is becoming increasingly likely, we're likely to really overshoot this 1.5 degree this year, perhaps again, and certainly next year. We could be looking, James Hansen reckons we could be looking at something like 1.7 degrees or something like that next year. So, it's sobering in terms of this rapid increase in temperature. And then we look at what's required in terms of reductions. And you can have a look at all the detail on these slides afterwards if you watch this presentation again. But I kind of wanted to capture what was happening. So unsurprising to most people on this call, 10 years after Paris, the world isn't on track. Right? There's a whole load of policies in place. There's been lots of progress in terms of policies, and the Paris Agreement has allowed these pledges to be made. But a lot of the pledges haven't actually been translated into policies. And you can see there on the right that in terms of pledges and targets, that gets us to about 2.4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. But in terms of current policies, we could be looking at something like 3 degrees by the end of this century still. So we're well overshooting that 1.5 degree goal. And in fact, every likelihood is that we'll reach 1.5 degrees by the end of the 2020s and certainly by the beginning of the 2030s. And then we'll be heading towards 2 degrees of warming. And I just thought I'd show this, and this is something that I used to show, that's one of Kevin Anderson's slides, and some of this information as well is from those various sources on the bottom there. If we really wanted to get to 1.5 degrees, we really did need to start a long time ago. And we're really looking now at having to reduce our emissions each year by about the scale that we had in COVID, so about 7% per year. And indeed, we're looking at needing to reduce our global emissions by about 45% by 2030 or so. So we need rapid action. We need rapid emissions reductions, but we're almost certainly going to overshoot this 1.5 degree warming target. And then if we want to get to 2 degrees, we still need these very, very rapid reductions in emissions. So a 2 degree pathway is still possible, but only with urgent action. And you can see there in terms of some of the nice information that's available from things like Climate Action Tracker, in terms of where the policies take the gap, I suppose, between what countries have pledged and their targets, and then the gap between actually what they've said they will do in terms of policies. So there's still a very, very large gap in terms of that, and that, if you remember from before, translates through into about 1 degree of extra warming by the end of the century. And even if we implement all of those pledges, we're still looking at more than 2 degrees of warming by the end of this century. And that really matters, right? And I showed this slide in the National Emergency Briefing, and that matters because if we get very small changes in average temperature or indeed rainfall, we get very big changes in extremes, right? So the mean change translates through into much, much bigger changes in extremes. And we're already living in at least a 1.36 degree warmer world. For the last few years, we've lived in a 1.5 degree warmer world, arguably. It has been almost 1.5 degrees warmer. And we're seeing a number of record-shattering rainfall extremes around the world every day, certainly every week now, most of which are no longer reported in the media. We only really see them in the UK now if they affect white people, and if they affect people close to us, so perhaps in Europe, right, or the US. We didn't even recently hear about the devastating floods in New Zealand or Australia. So it's becoming less and less.
Sorry, just a quick one. Somebody on the chat saying your mic is a little bit quieter. I don't know if you can turn your volume up or have your mic slightly closer. It's still hearable fine, but...
Okay, the microphone's on the camera, so it's probably not... Okay. Let me see if I can sit a bit closer. Yeah, I'm not sure how you turn the...
You got a thumbs up. It's better, I think. Just a bit
closer. Good. We're not... we're not hearing about these events anymore. I always thought that with climate change, we would see more extreme weather events and people would suddenly realize, actually, gosh, we're getting all these extreme weather events. Climate change is real. But actually, we don't hear about this in the media anymore. But nevertheless, we're seeing more and more of these record-shattering rainfall extremes. We're seeing these huge floods, many of which are caused by these blocked situations, which you can see in the bottom left there of the slide, where we get a very big high pressure system, an omega block it's called because it looks like the Greek letter omega, which sits in one place for a long time, and it traps these low pressure centers in place. They become cut off from the jet stream and they sit in one place, and they basically just draw more and more moisture from the warm oceans and precipitate huge amounts of rainfall over the land. And that's happened almost every year for the last few years in Europe, it's happened in other parts of the world as well. And just an example here of Storm Daniel in 2023. The German floods in 2021 were one of these types of events as well. But Storm Daniel produced over 1 meter of rainfall over a very large area of Greece over 3 days. It flooded a fifth of the agricultural land in Greece. And they caused devastating impacts on agriculture, devastating impacts on property and people. This particular event was so strong and the sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean were so warm that it actually became a hurricane, a medicane, and then hit Libya. And we saw the devastating floods there as well. And this was a series of events that happened around the world for about a week from the 3rd to the 10th of September 2023. A similar type of events happened in 2024 as well, and you can see the same type of event here with this big high pressure and a cutoff, what we call a cutoff low pressure, causing Storm Boris, which caused the Eastern European floods. We had a similar event in Valencia as well in October 2024, similar cutoff low type event, which obviously caused those devastating floods in Valencia as well. You know, we review what's happening every year, and we can say that extreme rainfall is becoming much more intense. We're seeing more of these blocking events. We're seeing more of these very big events that sit in one place. We're also seeing many more convective storms. Severe weather and convective storms is actually becoming a major insurance risk in the US now. We're also seeing more of these multi-hazard or compound events as well, which I'll talk a little bit about later.
The insurance companies are now actually really waking up to this, and it's really, you know, they're bringing it into their forecasts and, you know, about climate change and insurance, which shows how serious they're taking it and how serious we should all be taking it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think insurance, I've been trying to get interested in climate change for quite a long time, and suddenly insurance and reinsurance are really interested because obviously it's affecting their premiums. And actually, this is an article that I wrote with somebody from Willis, who about what risk managers need to know about flood risk, and this was one of the figures that we produced, which just shows some of the record-breaking floods that we had last year, which, you know, we're not actually anywhere near as serious in Europe as they were in other parts of the world. I think you can see from some of the numbers here. You know, particularly the events in Indonesia late last year caused huge numbers of deaths and displaced over 1 million people. You know, we see these events, but we don't really see the same levels of devastation as in other parts of the world yet. And so this is important. These patterns of blocking are really important because they actually cause these very linked events around the world, and they're partly caused by warming as well, because as the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles reduces, because the poles are warming at a much faster rate than the equator, that weakens the jet stream and it allows it to become more meandering, and that then makes more of these high pressure centers sit in place for a long time. You can see here, this is summer 2021. You've got the Canadian heat dome and you've got the wildfires caused by these big blocking highs. And then you've either side of them got these big flood events that are happening as well. So they're all interconnected and they happen in sequence. And we think they're, you know, relatively predictable as well. And I'll tell you a little bit about the fellowship that I'm doing at the moment, which is hopefully going to try to predict these types of events as well a few months ahead, which would be very helpful in terms of trying to save lives. One of the problems with this, though, is that as we get more of these connected extremes, actually they become more damaging as well. And this is from a study by Ryan Lee from Strathclyde University, and he looked at the MDAT data set, which basically characterizes the cost of single hazard and multi-hazard events, where 2 or more hazards happen at the same time or in sequence. And he found that about 19% of disasters globally involve multiple hazards, but they're actually responsible for nearly 60% of total economic losses. So as these events become more connected, and as we see these compounding and cascading impacts, we get more and more losses from these types of events. And I think I just wanted to make a point about imagination, and I'll come back to this at the end as well. But I think it's really important that we think about what's plausible. Actually, people didn't evacuate during the German floods, and a lot of that was because the authorities didn't imagine that the flood was going to be as bad as it was predicted to be. But they literally, the public and the authorities, could not actually imagine what the flood was going to do and how big it was going to be, because nobody had experienced that before. So part of preparing for climate change and preparing for these types of hazards is actually telling stories and having narratives and having, films or whatever it is, right? I think the arts and media really should become more involved here. It needs to be very much transdisciplinary about preparing for these types of events, because we need this imagination to actually prepare. The other thing that we need to do better as climate scientists is really thinking about, at the moment, and this probably will surprise you perhaps if you don't know very much about climate science, but we run all of these different models, and we come out with what basically a load of different climate model simulations. And then we basically take the average and we use that to tell us about the future. And obviously that's not the best way to do this, right? It's certainly not the way that engineers would plan a dam or something like that. And actually, if you look at climate model simulations, you can get very bad outcomes from models now, even. Rather than in the future. So I guess what we're doing there is we're basically really underestimating the potential for change and risk if we only use the multi-model mean to plan for the future and for future changes. So climate scientists need to be better at taking a risk-based approach as well to changes. What's good is that rather than just the very coarse resolution global climate models that we have used thus far, we've had a bit of a revolution in climate science, and we've basically now developed what's called convection permitting climate models, and they're basically weather forecast models. So we take what the UK Met Office uses for weather forecasts, we force it with greenhouse gases. They're really high resolution, so they're like 2-kilometre scale, and the good thing is they're able to actually simulate these really intense downpours of rainfall that come from thunderstorms. And we're actually able then to say something about what might happen to these types of events in the future, which we can't do from these very coarse resolution models. They don't give us they don't basically simulate that type of rainfall, and therefore we can't say anything about what's going to happen in the future. So they give us much better information that we can use for flood risk assessment, planning, and adaptation. They show really big increases in these events that cause flash flooding, so a 5-fold frequency increase by 2080 across the UK. They can also allow us to look at things like extreme winds and how they're changing, hail, lightning, all of these other things that aren't well captured within conventional climate models. So that's really good news. And therefore, we know quite a few things now about what will happen with warming to rainfall. And we know, for example, this is from both observational studies and from these convection permitting climate models, we know that as the atmosphere becomes warmer, the most intense part of the storm gets more intense, right? So if you look at the top there, you split the storm up into 5 equal parts. The bit that's the most intense at the moment gets even more intense. And also the storms become more front-loaded, which means that more of the rainfall falls at the beginning of the storm. Also in the UK, there's no restrictions on moisture availability. We expect the storms to become bigger because as the storm converges, it produces a higher intensity in the centre, but it also gets bigger because it can just converge more and more moisture from the ocean. And we see that happening already. The other thing that we see happening because of this reduction in the speed of the jet stream is we see more slow-moving storms, and of course we've seen that a lot over the last few years. And if you put all of these things together, we get higher intensity, bigger storms, and potentially more slow-moving storms. We see these really big floods that we've seen in recent years. And we had a study showing that these could become 14 times more common over Europe by 2100.
Wow, that's quite a heavy, full-on figure. Wow.
It is, yeah. The other really cool thing actually that they can do over in the Dutch Met Service now, and this is something I worked with Get Lenderink on last year, is for when we forecast an event, and you can see at the top there for the present, see if I can get it there, this one. So that would be an event, that's an event that happened in May 2023. We can also look at what that event would have looked like in the past, 1.5 degree cooler climate, and in a future warmer climate as well. And then we can actually look at what that does to the storm if we got the same event in a warmer or a cooler climate. And what we know from this is that you can get really big changes in rainfall intensity, actually, from warmer climates. And you can also get very, very big changes in the volume of the storm as well, not just the most intense part. And those can be 2 times what we get now for a 2 degree warmer climate. So you see something like a 14 to a 21% increase in the sort of volume of the storm per degree of warming. We've also looked at things like windstorms with these models, and we will, according to the models, get stronger windstorms in a warming climate. People might remember sting jets. There was one in Storm Eunice, there was one in Ireland last year as well. These convection permitting climate models can actually simulate these very, very intense winds that drop down from high in the troposphere and produce very damaging wind over a very small area in a short time. And they show that these intense windstorms become more frequent, and sting jets contribute more to the most extreme storms in the future as well in a warming climate. The other thing that we can see happening already, and this is just looking at observations, is very much increases in heat waves. We've obviously already seen record-breaking heat in the UK. We may well see this exceeded this summer, or certainly next summer, with this big El Nino. And it causes a lot of excess deaths when we get these heat events. You can see at the bottom there, that shows the increase in heat intensity across the northern hemisphere. There's a very big difference in Europe. So Europe is warming much faster than the rest of the northern hemisphere, both in terms of frequency of heat waves and the intensity of heat waves as well. And so extreme heat events are becoming more likely and more intense with climate change, and particularly in Europe and the UK. Of course, this has knock-on effects on water shortages as well, because when we get extreme heat, we tend to get no rain as well. And again, this is something I talked about in the National Emergency Briefing. We really need to be thinking about how do we plan for these types of dry events. And it's the 50th anniversary this year of the 1976 drought, and we've got some media events planned for June. And just thinking about how bad this event would be now is something we're running simulations for at the moment. The other thing we need to think about is how we manage these extreme weather events, and particularly last year with wildfires in Dorset. The Fire Brigades Union realised that basically UK fire services don't have the resources to keep the public safe anymore. I think this will be the case with other types of extreme weather as well. The other thing is in terms of heat. Again, talked about this at the National Emergency Briefing. The UK is going to get hotter, and it is getting hotter. But actually, we don't see any significant heat compared to places like Pakistan and India, where they're getting close already to the threshold of humid heat, where humans and other mammals can't survive. So you can't actually sweat enough at high humidity and high temperatures to actually cool your body down. And they're already approaching those sort of levels in parts of Pakistan and India. All of this is bad. So all of this is bad for people, for communities, but also for agriculture as well. And I think the last 3 years have shown the worst harvests in the last 50. And it's not just about UK farming, because we import 40% of our food. And actually increasingly extreme weather is a threat to the UK. Extreme weather elsewhere, sorry, is also a threat to the UK. And if that wasn't bad enough, I think there's some reasons to believe that actually climate models may be underestimating the potential for change for many types of extreme weather. For example, if we look at heat extremes, this is quite a nice paper that came out a couple of years ago now. They looked at the differences between what's happening in the real world, in observations, and what's happening in the climate models. And the observations are those red and orange lines on the plots there, and all of those little black dots are climate models. And what it shows is that the climate models just aren't simulating the changes in the large-scale atmospheric circulation that we're experiencing in the real world. And that means that they're really underestimating the changes in heat extremes. The other thing that climate models aren't doing well on is and this is for the UK, is they're underestimating the rate at which precipitation is increasing with temperature. And this is particularly for the winter in Northern Europe, but also for extremes as well. And you can see here the red line is the observations, and global climate models don't predict the observed changes that we've already seen in winter rainfall in the UK until the 2040s. And just to say, winter rainfall in the UK is increasing at a rate of about 7% per degree of warming, which is actually a theoretical relationship called Clausius-Clapeyron, and it's the rate at which the atmospheric moisture increases with warming. And that's probably to do with the fact that we have a very warm ocean next to us and there's no limitations on moisture supply. But that means basically that we're seeing an extra 3 million Olympic-sized swimming pools of water every year now. And obviously that has a knock-on effect on flooding as well, because the ground is more saturated all of the time than it ever was previously. But climate models are underestimating the rate at which this is happening. And those are the same models that we're then using to try and plan adaptation. So we really need to be thinking about these biases when we actually plan adaptation as well. Part of the reason that they underestimate all of these things is because they underestimate the persistence of these blocking events. And actually, convection permitting models do a bit better at this. We need these higher resolution models to try and get these kind of things right. But in general, the climate models are not getting the persistence of these high pressure systems that sit in one place for a long time. And that means they underestimate the heat waves and they underestimate the potential for these very big flood events as well into the future. So we need to do something about this to actually get some useful information that we can use for adaptation. Our last progress report from the Climate Change Committee made 4 urgent recommendations: that we need clear, measurable objectives for resilience across government, that adaptation needs to become part of mainstream planning and investment. I keep saying adaptation needs to be business as usual, actually. It needs to be basically thought about in every single policy that's made. And we need to move from plans, there are plans for adaptation, to delivery. because quite honestly, at the moment, the UK's preparations for climate change are wholly inadequate. And we need to actually do this now because the costs are going to be far greater later. The other thing we need to think about are the likelihood or the inevitability actually of having cascading climate risks, which will occur between different systems. So if we think about, for example, Storm Arwen, when Storm Arwen happened, and you know, it was a horrendous number of trees came down in the northeast of England, then we lost power, but lots of rural communities also lost water and telecommunications because all of those things are powered by energy. So you need pumping to supply water to rural communities, often because they're uphill. And you need now, with the new telecommunications we have, you need power as well for those. And often mobile phone masts are down as well, or mobile phone networks are down. So, you know, there's no power, there's no heating, there's no water, there's no telecommunication. So you have these cascading issues through just losing power. And they take a long time to put back up again as well in rural communities because often trees are down and, you know, they're inaccessible as well. I saw a brilliant community in Scotland, actually, Fir Tree, I think it was called, just north of Glasgow, which had their own community resilience plan. They had these kind of, because they get flooded a lot of the time, or often get flooded, they had these 2 centres where they had emergency generators, they had food, they had power, you know, and heating, and people would go there if there was a flood event, if they were flooded, or even if just the house was out of power, there is a place they can go and be safe. And I think that, you know, these are the sort of things that actually communities should be thinking about. And, you know, as I say, a well-adapted UK report is coming out on the 20th of May. And I'm not telling you here what is in it, but certainly these are the sort of things that I think are needed for resilient communities in the future.
Hayley, where will that come out? Where can people access that?
Access what? The well-adapted UK report?
Well-adapted UK report, yeah.
It's going to be released on the 20th of May and it will be on the Climate Change Committee website.
Okay.
Yeah. There's lots of different sections on different aspects of you know, like there's one on water, there's one on transport, all of these different aspects. There's one on buildings, etc., etc. But you know, I think the message that I want to convey here is that it won't be possible to adapt every community to every type of extreme weather, right? And we can see that happening already. There's an example now of a community in Wales where the local council have just said, look, we can't protect you from flooding. It's going to cost too much for us to build a flood scheme. It's cheaper for us to buy your houses and move you away from this area, right? And that's also happening in Fairbourne as well, where they've obviously stopped protecting the community from coastal flooding as well. So there are going to have to be difficult decisions made in the future about where do we make investment to adapt, or where do we have to just say, look, we can't make it safe for you unless you're willing to put up with being flooded 4 times a year. It's not a good idea for you to live here anymore. But there are lots of other places where we can, and we have solutions already, and we know what to do. We know how to retrofit homes. You know, there's brilliant examples from all over the world and certainly other parts of Europe about what's going on already. They have much more extreme heat. They have much more extreme rainfall, etc. We know what to do, but we just need to start to do it and to think about making investments. I think one of the important things as well is it's not just about thinking about future changes. It's about thinking about being resilient now, because we're already living in a changed environment. And I do believe that the weather extremes that we're experiencing at the moment are the least extreme weather that you're going to experience in your lifetimes. Part of this as well is about planning. It's about knowing about early warning systems, knowing what to do when you receive an alert, having an evacuation plan for your house, right? we've all got fire evacuation plans. We don't have them for floods. We don't have them for other things. We need to think about this as a community as well. Who goes to check on your elderly neighbour? All of this stuff. We can retrofit buildings. We can build greener cities. We can put in sustainable urban drainage solutions. We have the models to do this and the tools to do this, but we need the resource to do this. We need increased regulations. We need standards, I think, for the use of climate information and for what needs to be done as well and how you do it. But the solutions are there. They're out there already. And we can see that with Copenhagen. And I talked about this at the National Emergency Briefing. It's a really nice example of a city that experienced two incredibly big rainfall events, quite short duration, but very, very large rainfall events in 2011, and then decided that they would actually put investment into actually adapting to a wetter, more extreme climate, put in tunnels underground. Where I live in Newcastle, they've just put a big drainage, a sort of tank in under the town moor. For example, you can put these solutions in to actually stop water and stop flooding. And they've put in more green parks and sustainable urban drainage features as well in Copenhagen, to act as sponges when it rains. We have the solutions in place. We've got tools that we've developed to actually work out where these should go. But we need the investment now in these adaptation measures.
That's what it needs, the funding and the resourcing and the spaces to do it. Copenhagen, I went to the climate summit there and they really went for it on all these solutions afterwards. And they're a good example as a city of what we could be doing. Over.
I've nearly finished, but what I wanted to do, and I don't expect any of you to necessarily understand this, but one of a nice thing is that I've just been given 10 years of funding by the Royal Society to actually work on a project that I've called Extreme Futures. And the idea behind this is that we will come up with a seamless framework to predict extreme weather events and extreme flood events around the world. And the idea behind this is that we try to understand climate variability better, and we understand the links between different parts of the atmosphere and the oceans, and we can therefore predict extreme weather events, not exactly where they're going to be, but the raised likelihood of these a few months to a year ahead. And that will really help with planning things like agriculture. What type of crops do you put in? Is it going to be a drought this year? Is it going to be a flood this year? That kind of thing. It will help with warnings of floods, in terms of saving lives as well. And the good thing about this framework is then we can use it to actually understand what's happening with climate models and what they're good and bad at, and actually come up with better projections for adaptation as well. So that's 10 years of funding to do that with a big international team. I just want to finish by reminding you of something I talked about in the National Emergency Briefing. So that's very much thinking about how extreme rainfall could get in the UK. So there have been a number of these big, large-scale cut-off low rainfall events in recent years. So I've put a few of them there. So for example, in Valencia, they had 3/4 of a metre of rainfall, which was more than the annual average rainfall in 24 hours. In Austria, in Storm Boris, they got about 2/3 of their average annual rainfall in 3 or 4 days. And in parts of Greece, in Storm Daniel, they received almost 2 times their annual average rainfall in 3 or 4 days. Now, I think given our climate, we're unlikely to get 2 times our annual average rainfall in 3 or 4 days. But there's no reason we couldn't get something like what they had in Storm Boris. So if we receive 2/3 of our average annual rainfall in 3 or 4 days in East Anglia or London, that would be around 400 millimetres of rainfall, something like that, in 3 or 4 days. And in other parts of the UK, it could be even higher. It's perhaps less likely to happen in other parts of the UK, but certainly, that's a staggeringly large rainfall event if it did happen over London. And the thing to note is that that could happen today, right? That's even without climate change. And when we actually look at this operational attribution system that we've set up, we show that the whole event can intensify by something between 7 and 14% per degree of warming. So, you can see with climate change, these events have the capability to get bigger and bigger and bigger as well. So it's really important that as societies and as communities, we actually start to think about what would we do if something like this was forecast? How would we behave? What's our kind of how would we react and respond? How do we make sure that people are safe? As I say, we can't necessarily plan to adapt every community for these types of extremes because they're really, really big events. And some of the time, the thing we're going to have to do is to actually just get out of the way, and stay safe. So I think it's really important, though, that we actually imagine what could happen so that we can plan for those types of possibilities. And this is basically my final slide. And I've just kind of updated my one from the National Emergency Briefing. Extreme weather is here. We're not ready. I think we can be. The solutions are out there. We have the technology and tools to adapt. We know what to do, but we need to basically do it now. We need to make bold decisions, and we need to build a more resilient UK. I've said a safer, fairer, more resilient UK at the bottom there, and I think that's possible. But we actually need to start today. All right, thanks very much.
Absolutely brilliant, Hayley. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive, and thank you for all your work of bringing awareness to this. I know you're award-winning on some levels of things. Thank you so much for that. Really, really powerful. So, folks, what's to say there? A couple of bits, and then if you've got a question, a feedback, or a comment, if you keep them fairly briefish, if you need to. But the down at the bottom of the screen, there's a little heart-shaped button. And you can raise a hand like that so we can see who's 1, 2, 3 or whatever. Just to say, one of the powerful slides there was, when 8 floods across the whole world in 2025 that Hayley showed, and that climate doesn't know any borders. It doesn't recognise man-made borders, and these floods and these storms will come, and it's up to us to really build these resilient networks and these spaces and get the proper funding to build the solutions and be prepared as best we can to deal with these things and cooperate across borders. Into the future. And I'm very glad I was going to ask you about solutions at the end, Hayley, but you've actually went into quite a few solutions there. But maybe a bit later, if you want to say what you think the top solutions we could do are. We really want to give people the tools here, the spaces, and what they can actually do in their lives to to start building these solutions from these climate resilient spaces, community spaces. Ed Jarvis, I think, first off the mark on the University Challenge, and then Dave Levinson. Ed Jarvis.
Thank you so much, Phoenix. Hayley, thank you so much for everything you're doing at the NEB and the Climate Change Committee. Really appreciate all your efforts. So that's a hell of a presentation. I won't be the only person in the room having an emotional reaction to that. It's intense. We're heading in an appalling direction at speed, and we're not taking anything like the action we need to at the speed we need to. I think that's why we're all here, right? And it's a mad world where we've had the climate movements had to put on a national emergency briefing. Where's the BBC? Where's the ITV? Where is the media here? But my question to you is, I wonder from where you're sat, Hayley, what's stopping the global wartime mobilization that we need to act against the climate and nature crisis? What are the blockers to accelerated mitigation and to accelerated adaptation and nature regeneration? And what can we do about them? So what are the blockers and what can we do you think, from where you're sat?
There's loads, but I mean, I think political will So, you know, political cycles are so short term. We have the extra complication of Trump. It's not nice of me calling it a complication, but you know, we have someone in charge in the US who's basically a climate denier at the moment. There are lots of other countries that don't really want to act. It's not in their national interest to act on climate change either, right? And they block negotiations and they block science, actually, even within the IPCC process. There's a huge amount of money in fossil fuels, and the lobby is big. They're also much more organized and control the media as well. So it's there's lots of blockers. I think what does give me hope is the fact that the financial world is starting to wake up to climate change, and lots of people with very big investments realize that those investments, those long-term investments, are going to be seriously affected by some of the things I've been talking about today. So I do have hope that actually things will change, but I don't think it will be driven by politics or politicians. I think it will be driven very much by economics and finance, and also things like insurance and reinsurance, actually. And hopefully eventually by people voting for the right politicians. But I think that will come later. And it'll probably be a bit of a kickback first. You know, yeah. I mean, as individuals, I mean, you all seem to be doing, you know, really trying very hard in your own local communities and where you can. But we need systemic change right from the top to actually be able to make the changes we need to make rapidly enough. So we all just have to keep pushing where we can, and I think doing what we can as individuals to try to push the message out there. I think Hugh Montgomery was saying when I was with him at a People's Emergency Briefing in London recently that each of us has to persuade 7 of our closest friends to act and to change their minds on climate change if they're not doing anything now, and then they tell 7 more people, and I think it's a good model. You know, it's an exponential model.
Hugh was brilliant. He did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and that 7 by 7 by 7, at least to 560 odd people or whatever it is. So yeah, keep networking the solutions, folks, wherever you are. Over to David Leverton, MP Watch, and then Kathy afterwards. Over.
Thank you, Hayley. Scary and inspirational at the same time. I'm interested in how the students at Newcastle react to studying this subject, and what do they feel about the world around them and the legacy that we're leaving, you know, that my generation are leaving for them, and how motivated are they to drive change? Because I think that our generation has completely failed so far, and I'm hoping that the next generation coming through will be so much more switched on. So how do the students react?
I mean, yeah, I was talking to somebody after one of the People's Emergency Briefings that I organised at Newcastle, actually. He emailed me after, it's called Godfrey. He emailed me after the National Emergency Briefing, and I'd never responded to him. But I mean, it's I think a lot of them are very disillusioned, and I think that a lot of them know a lot less than you would expect them to know. And part of that is because our education system doesn't tell them really enough about climate change and what's happening. And what it does tell them, if they happen to do GCSE geography, is one of the few places that actually is taught. A lot of it's out of date. You know, there are questions that say, what are the benefits of global warming? Yeah, and some of the answers are ridiculous as well and just untrue to the questions in those exam papers. And I know there's a big push at the moment to actually try to change that education, you know, all the way from the Climate Ambassadors Programme, which is trying to improve climate education across educational establishments, all the way from nurseries actually through to universities, and you know, the Ministry for Eco Education, they're called, and others, and the Royal Met Soc and others who are trying to actually improve the GCSE curriculum. I think we need to do more at universities, if I'm honest. In my opinion, and I'm not senior management at Newcastle, but in my opinion, we should be teaching a course on climate change and sustainability, not just climate change, to every undergraduate student and probably every postgraduate student as well. And I think that because it's so important, it's something they're going to have to live with for the rest of their lives. And I think there is a lot of disillusionment. I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge as well. But I think that those people that do know about it are quite terrified, actually. And, you know, people talk about not having kids, people talk about not doing this and that because of what's coming, and there's no point, right? And I think it's terrifying. I mean, I've got 2 teenage boys, and it's really concerning. But we, as you know, people who might have the capacity to change something, we need to do more about getting the education system changed so that more people know about this.
Yeah. Okay. Very powerful and important there. Dave, you good? Kathy Fallon, then Linda Aspey.
Hello, thank you very much. I'd just like to make a comment, and then I've got a question. So the comment is, after the film, we're supposed to be requesting people to sign the open letter to get a televised TV people's briefing, which is good. But I think that needs to be extended to a social media briefing campaign as well, because the young people who've just been talking about, they don't watch TV and they don't look at the news. So everything they know comes from social media. So I think that's crucial. And my question is, at the briefings as well, we're supposed to be having these discussions about local impacts and implications and what we can do about it. And I don't actually know, do councils and local authorities, are they required to have climate adaptation plans in place already, or is there a plan that they need to have them in place by a certain time? Because that's something that we could be pushing for.
Good question. I mean, the first part, I think there are plans to do things around social media as well, actually. But I guess it's the case of having the funding. I don't watch TV, to be honest. I think lots of people who are quite old don't watch TV anymore either. I only ever watch it on, you know, catch up or something. So I think people, but maybe people would watch it if they knew that it was on. I did watch the COVID briefings, for example, right? If you make it enough of a national moment, people will watch normal TV. But I agree with you. We need social media. We need influencers. We need people that people trust. Different types of people trust to send those messages, right? And the types of people I would trust are not the same as what my children would trust. In terms of the adaptation plans for local councils, I don't think, honestly, I should know this, but I don't think there is a need for them to have an adaptation plan legally at the moment. Many do, actually, because many local councils declared climate emergencies and put together action plans around sort of 2019, 2020. I know I was involved in leading a net zero task force in the city in Newcastle, and we developed a climate action plan for mitigation and adaptation. I don't think there's a legal requirement to have one, though, although I could be wrong. I probably should know that. So yes, it is something that it would be good if there was a mandate to have one.
Okay, that's really useful. We'll take a couple more questions. We're probably going to wrap it up there because we're just a bit over an hour, but it's all really quality and fantastic. Just say very briefly before Linda, we've really got to, empower the next generation. There is so much doom scrolling and desperation out there. We need to give people hope that there are solutions. They can do things. We're starting some tree planting parties with young people, with music and older people and all ages working together, and Cara and linking with landowners. We have to give people hope that there are solutions, and little actions build up and make big differences.
There are solutions, though. I mean, the solutions aren't the problem. It's the will and the money, actually.
Yeah, funding, and give us the spaces and the political will. Linda, over to Linda, and then Gordon for the last question. Linda,
Thank you.
Psychology Alliance.
Yeah, thank you again, Hayley. Fantastic presentations as always. Really, really informative. I've got a comment and then a question. And my comment is, I'm just really pleased to hear young people being talked about. But I would also encourage people to not say to young people, "You'll sort it, it's your thing in your generation." We need to be seen by them to be really being active. This is our problem, we caused it. And the more we say, we hope that this generation is going to be more clever than we are. No. We need to be showing them that we are going all out for this, for them, so that gives them that support they need. Otherwise, so I really want to stress that. And by the way, I've just writing a guide with my colleague in Climate Psychology Alliance about talking to young people and about young people coming to the NEB or the PEB screenings. We're advising 16-year-olds, although the BBFC has said 12A. We think for many, many reasons it should be 16 plus. So that's coming out this week. So, but thank you. But yeah, let's hold young people in mind differently. It's not their problem. They need to see us. But I had a question about immediacy. We know from psychology that people do push things out. We call it distancing. It's next year, that other place on the other side of the world. And you've done a really good job in bringing it closer. I still know people that will still be able to distance that and think it's not really going to apply because it's the end of the century, it's the next 10 years. And I'm wondering what El Nino might bring for us this year, what kind of year you might be expecting.
Just to start, like the first point that you made, I took my 14-year-old, who's nearly 15 actually, along to the People's Emergency Briefing that I spoke on a panel at in London with Chris Packham and others. And I was wondering how he would take it. He wanted to go, but he thinks that the briefing should be shown to all kids at school, not really young kids, but anybody GCSE years or above. So his kind of age, he's in year 10. Certainly to sixth formers, I agree, but he thinks that people need to be informed. I said to him, did you not find it terrifying and really depressing? And he said, no, but we need to know the facts because people don't know what's going on. And actually, it's really important that even if it is scary, we know the facts. So that was the first thing.
Can I add something to that, Hayley? Do you mind if I just do that very briefly? Is that all right? He's lucky to have you. You know what you're doing and you're thoughtful about it, and he's lived in that world. There will be some who come along, and there'll be some in the perhaps the discussion who may not be so guarded about what they say. They may say things that are, we're all completely, etc. And we don't know how the audiences will react and how the parents will be able to cope with what the child hears and all of that. So I think he's very lucky to have someone like you, and not everyone does. And so we're not saying don't, we're just saying this is, real care and caution, just as you said.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm trying to remember what your second question was about immediacy, wasn't it?
Yeah, about El Nino, what your thoughts are about that, what we might see this year.
So, well, potentially very hot weather this summer, a bit like 2022. Definitely the possibility of a big heat event. Might not reach the UK, certainly Europe though. I think the other thing we can probably expect almost certainly expect is a very, very wet winter next year. Much wetter than we've seen. There is a link between El Nino events and wet winters in the UK that we're about to submit a paper on, actually. But we can expect that. And then next year we'll see even hotter temperatures, because we normally get the effect of El Nino happening the year after the actual event.
Really?
So it starts kind of late this year and goes, it's called El Nino because it's the boy child. It's a kind of, it reaches its peak around Christmas time.
Yeah.
And then goes into next year. So we can expect effects on food, actually, rice production and other types of food next year.
Yeah, thank you.
We need to build the food resilient networks. Gordon Braddock, thank you for being patient. Last question to Mr. Gordon Braddock. Over.
Well, it was actually about El Nino. I was going to ask you, was it this year or next year it was going to happen? This anyway, in my opinion, a powerful scientific theory explains everything you know about the phenomenon, but predicts new things. And if it predicts something which is then discovered, that is a really powerful theory. So are you confident that El Nino will make this summer very, very hot, the winter very, very wet, and then next summer very, very hot? Because if you could publish it now and say this is what's going to happen, and it does happen, then I think people will sit up and take more notice of you. I'm not saying people aren't taking notice of you, but those who are deniers, for example.
Agree. And I mean, that's exactly what we're going to be trying to do in the fellowship, right? We started working on this in November. There's a few more people in place now. It takes a long time to employ people. My colleague produced a prediction for the next 2 years in November, and he actually predicted a super El Nino, and it seems to be playing out, actually. So, you know, what we need to do is, at the moment, we've got a system that's not automated. If you imagine it's not coded up, it's kind of very much based on physical processes and understanding, but it's not automated. We need to automate that system, and we need to then produce predictions. And if those predictions are realised, then people will believe the system, I guess. We are planning on sort of releasing some of this in June at the launch of the Extreme Futures project in London. So you might hear about some of it then, I guess. But I mean, I absolutely agree with you. We need to be getting this sort of information out there, and yeah, if we can start to predict where these extreme weather events are going to happen ahead of time, then it's basically a combination of climate variability and predictable cycles and climate change on top of that as well that's causing these.
All right.
I can say now that global warming has been taught in geography since the 1980s. Yeah. How many students have absorbed it and how much the teachers knew about it, I don't know. And in the 1990s, it was taught in science too. I remember teaching climate change as a science teacher. Well, it was called global warming. And I said that what it's going to do is to make the summers hotter and the winters wetter and milder.
Not true everywhere, though, is it?
Well, that's the problem. But I think the books I taught from implied that it was Britain. Yes.
Okay. For the British played. All right, guys. Thank you so much to everyone. Very much to Hayley. I'm going to hand over to Hayley for just parting comments in a second, but just to say, next week we've got another major speaker like Hayley from the National Emergency Briefing, which is Lieutenant General Nugi. He's an ex-NATO senior commander, and he spoke very eloquently and importantly about how we need to shift perspectives on what's going on for the climate, and it is a national emergency issue, and we need to mobilize on a major level. We have the information, we have the solutions, we need to get the spaces set up and the proper funding into our projects so that we can get on with implementing the solutions we know already exist. So tune in next week. And I think somebody mentioned water. the week after that, maybe the 20th, we've got Enfield Climate Action Forum with a major webinar all about water and what we can do with the renationalising water and other situations. So, Hayley, over to you for final parting comments. Anything you want to say? And thank you so much for coming and for all of your great work. Big shout out to Women in Science. Put a couple of bits in the chat there. Over to you for parting comments. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you all for inviting me, and it was brilliant to hear about all the things that are happening actually within this network. So, you know, keep up the good work. Hopefully we'll make some changes and get more people on board in terms of changing our trajectory with climate change. That would be good. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. And are you based in Newcastle?
Yes.
You are, right. There was a link up with the National Trust. There's a building near Newcastle they want people to use for environment things. I'll message you about it. All right, keep networking solutions wherever you are, folks. Big up, Hayley, and all the scientist teams. Thanks very much for coming, everyone.
Thank
See you next week.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.